Ever since childhood, I've had an interest in M.C. Escher and his works of amazing art. The way he made two-dimensional shapes and drawings blend into a three-dimensional appearance. It always fascinated the ever-loving fuck out of me. I couldn't help but smile when looking at any of his work, or most related to it. So, in 1981, when flyers depicting impossible shapes and figures started to litter our streets, I noticed. These flyers were printed out on colored paper, using the common dot matrix printers of the era. There was never a name or number, no excuse for the flyers. They depicted impossible shapes and figures that threatened to jump from the page directly into your eyes. They started out innocent enough at first. A few impossible triangle shapes, maybe some stairs that twist into nothing. You know, shit like that. After a couple of days, things started to get darker. The flyers were a mixture of Escher and Poe, as in Edgar Allan Poe. Instead of staircases and triangles, it was now headstones and open graves. Everything had eyes. The eyes seemed to move and blink if you moved the paper just right. People in town were starting to talk and worry, and talk some more. Things got a little comical at times, with theories ranging from deranged serial killer to ads for an upcoming restaurant. Of course, nobody actually knew what they were. See, small towns across the country have one thing in common: gossip. Not every citizen had seen the flyers yet, as some areas were just more remote. In fact, it looked like someone would just dump a load of flyers and let the wind deliver them. It was about 5 days in. That's when the flyers got even more disturbing, even hostile. To look at these images for long seemed to drive folks temporarily crazy as balls. To this day, I could even picture those fucking flyers. At first, there's nothing really there, just shapes and lines and dots. Then, like the much later magic eye things, if you gazed at the images just right, you could start to see the hidden pictures. Up to this point, all of the flyers released around one time would be printed on the same color paper, and they had the same exact design. This time, things were vastly different. Blue sheets depicted some sort of animal feasting on a flayed open corpse. Yellow sheets revealed some type of thing erupting from a man's back. Green sheets, those were the ones that got me. They depicted children eating from a dead woman's body. The red sheets, they showed some kind of thing that appeared to be Satan, half man, half goat with twisted horns and a long spade-tipped tail with a forked tongue. This round of flyers triggered numerous calls flooding into 911 dispatch center, which was located in the basement of the courthouse. At least 200 people called in, some even going as far as to walk 3 miles to a payphone just to call in and report those vile flyers. That is what spurred my boss into making me take point on the investigation. This would be my first trip to the rodeo of detectivehood. It was both a big honor and a giant fuck you to me. Because if I could actually solve this, or at least peg the sick bastard distributing the flyers, it would cement my career. However, if I failed, it would kill it. I started my investigation by looking for patterns and where the flyers showed up. I noticed that the flyers would be distributed early mornings before sunup, on the days with strong early morning winds. That told me that the perp was intelligent, and had a way to accurately predict the high winds. It also showed the locations of the drop points, a peak above town, a ridge behind town, or even the small hills in people's farms. Anywhere with a higher elevation than the town square. That explained why some folks hadn't even seen a flyer. They were in the valleys, to the other side. I decided to hop in the car and go to the nearest drop point. I didn't use lights or sirens because I didn't think the course of investigation was an emergency. When I finally arrived at the top of Reynolds Point, I was greeted with an awful sight indeed. There's what appeared to be a crude altar constructed of rocks, twigs, tanned skin from deers and squirrels. Upon a small flat rock in the middle of the altar was the corpse of a mountain cat, a small breed of mountain lion. It had been killed and dissected with haste, as if somebody hurriedly looked through the insides of the poor thing. The intestines were coiled beside its head, Its stomach had been flipped inside out. It was now holding the poor thing's penis and testicles. In the place of its missing eyes, 2 chunks of amber holding small lizard-looking things inside. I called out for the evidence collection team to clean the mess up, and I drove to the next suspected drop point. I drove to Madlands Ridge with the lights on, and my foot on the throat of the interceptor. I used to love the sound those things made. When the 4 barrels opened up, the engine could really stretch its legs. I was driving fast. Too fast, honestly. When I approached the Ridge access road, I almost didn't make the turn. But stupidity was strong with me that day. I flew up the road using the siren now, and as I tried to slow down and pull off the road at the hiking trail, a gigantic black dog, bigger than any dog I had ever seen, charged at me from the forest, directly toward my car. I slammed on the brakes, attempting to not murder somebody's pet, but I couldn't slow down the massive 4-door cruiser in time. I watched as the creature's face distorted into something unimaginable, just as the front bumper rammed into its body. There was no dent, no thud, no blood. It wasn't really there. I stopped the boat of the car in the middle of the road and just sat there looking around. Lights and sirens still continued to run overhead. I was shaken from my stupor when the radio cracked to life. The evidence team had found the altar. They were not happy, but they had no choice but to collect everything. I finally managed to steer the car over to the wide spot so I could park and hike my fat ass up the little hill to the flat-lined ridge. As I climbed the hill, I noticed dark spots in the soil and splotches of reddish and black liquid that had fallen on the leaves. That nervous feeling in my stomach started to increase to an almost intolerable level. I could feel something in my bones. I knew I would find something terrible on that hill. I expected another altar, complete with mutilated animal corpses. I was right, but so wrong. As I neared the top of the hill, I could see the circular field stone surrounding a makeshift altar. Upon the altar, there was a body, all right, but not a fucking woodland animal like I expected. It was the body of a human, a small child, naked and mutilated. The insides were torn out and strewn about the altar. The poor kid's head wasn't even there. Neither were her fingers or the soles of her feet. The bastard took everything we could use to identify the kid. Now, I was pissed. I called dispatch and had Irene turn out a coroner, and let the evidence crew know they had more work up here too. Later that day, I would find 3 more altars, each one with a different body. A deer, sheep, coyote, then a poor mountain cat, and the child. Each location was documented, cleaned, removed, and reconstructed in the basement of the jail. That was where we did our recreations. It took us a while to figure out the next bit, actually too long. It was 3 days later when I finally decided to put up thumbtacks in the county map to designate each altar. That's when it became apparent. The fucking altars were arranged in a pentagram. That fact cemented the idea of Satanism into our minds. Hell, if it had not been for the child's body, we would have collectively shrugged off the entire thing as some prank by some sick-ass fucking teenager. We would have never had thought that it would have turned out to be this. During the next week, we talked to more than 100 people, the biggest majority of which were clueless as to what we asked. There were a few we managed to find out were into drugs, but no Satan worship. That is, until we discovered a woman by the name of Gina Paisley. She was a self-proclaimed white witch turned dark magic. Magic being spelled with a K, of course. Gina was nervous when we confronted her with the pictures of the animals. I saved the child's body for last, to help me gauge her involvement criminally. When I showed her the picture of the folder, and I placed it down on the table in front of her, she went nuts. She jumped out of her chair that she was seated in. She started to pull handfuls of hair from her head, as she screamed, "No, not like that. You called wrong. He was wrong. We're all gonna die if he isn't stopped." My sergeant and I exchanged worried glances as a deputy restrained her. We cuffed her to the table. When she finally calmed herself down a bit, we continued to question her. During the questioning, which lasted 11 hours due to her mental breakdowns, we discovered that her and her son had been trying to summon a demon to do their, and I quote, "dirty work we can't do without going to prison," end quote. It took us an additional hour and a half to find the son. We kicked in the door of his trailer. He was standing there behind the little Lawson girl. Poor little Amy was tied to a chair with a gag in her mouth, a blindfold on her head, and it was all she was wearing. I shot before I could even think. I saw the knife in his hand, and I saw the hand moving towards the girl. I turned his fucking head into a jackass-o-lantern. We searched the home after releasing the terrified child. I gave her my jacket and button-up shirt to wear until the ambulance arrived. We found a dozen books of summoning rituals, all in Latin. We had to send the books to the University of Kentucky just to be translated. We found 2 more children tied up in the spare bedroom, both drugged and asleep. The guy had taken them from a few towns over to avoid raising suspicion. We found his journal, and in it, he wrote how he wanted to summon a demon, his dark lord, and how he wanted to give himself wholly to the beast. Most of the spiral-bound book was written many fantasies, in which the devil would sexually assault the writer, sometimes with force, but most often by the guy's own choice. He talked about how the world was not good enough to house him and his mother, who he had admitted to being in a sexual relationship with, having a baby with her as well. He then goes on to talk about how the baby was sacrificed to Satan on his 666th day of life. That was what started his quest to raise Satan. Gina was charged with complicity to kidnapping, complicity to murder, cruelty to animals, desecration of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and even with the incest. She was sentenced to 98 years and 1 day in jail by the Honorable Judge T. Lawson. We never found the computer that printed the papers. Hell, neither one of the Paisleys even owned a printer or a computer. We did, however, receive an anonymous letter, claiming to be responsible for the flyers, saying they knew those 2 were up to some sick shit, and they knew if the pictures got bad enough, eventually the police were going to investigate. We never saw another Twisted Escher wannabe. Sorry this was a longer one, folks, but it took me a bit to finish it. The case still brings a tear whenever I remember it. I mourn not only for the child, but for the parents of that child. Being out there, knowing your child is gone, but not why or even if she's still alive. If they read this, please, please forgive me. I tried to get an ID, even a few years ago. I went so far as to pay for a DNA testing. However, the blood was just too degraded. Same with the marrow. I tried to bring your family closure, I really did. I'm sorry, guys. I'm spent. Good night. We'll get another story soon. I want to thank all my lovely patrons currently listed on screen right now. Dan R, Neophyte Games, Chaos X, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A, Daniel H, Maximilian Charles P, GoGo Q Puppy LLC, Young Sykes, Dark Side of the Bear, Revenant Paul Team, Mr. Swiston, and Sarcastic B. Guys, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any suggestion for stories, please let me know.